Welcome everybody. This is the last video lecture here for your review for the final exam, which I just posted yesterday online. You cannot access it yet, but if you go into assignments, you can see that our final is here and it will launch on the night of May 14th. So at midnight on the 14th, which is 12 a.m. on May 15th, will be your availability there, and then it doesn't close until May the 18th at midnight. So you've got a total of 96 hours there to get that final taken and submitted. If you have any other questions about that, just email me. But as far as today goes, your review document itself can be found over here in Files. So if we click on that, and it will take you over into all of these drop documents here, and your final review is the PowerPoint document that we see here. Just remember also that you've got your study guide with all the vocabulary terms that are fair game for that, if you want to use that also for studying. But if we go over to this final review document here and open it up, that is going to bring us to our PowerPoint here. And so we will get it into full screen. So as we begin this, it's important to remember that we have been covering chapters 7, 8, and 9. We skipped over chapter 10 and did 11, 12, and 13. So we've just got 6 chapters total, and the farthest one back, right after the midterm, was chapter 7 on painting techniques. So we can see the list of those there. Remember that you have 2 major components in any paint. You've got a pigment and then a binder. Something that's coloring it and something that is allowing it to stick together and then also stick onto the surface. So remember, like with encaustic, the one at the top, we were mixing wax as the binder with a pigment and then applying that liquid wax to our surface. Whereas fresco, we're using plaster as the binder and we're mixing pigment into that and then applying it to a wall. Tempera is the one that was using egg to be able to mix your pigment into and then apply that to the surface. And the great change that we see coming around the time of the Renaissance was with oil, as far as mixing linseed oil as a binder with the pigment and then being able to apply it to a surface. And what was so revolutionary about oil paint was it did not dry quickly like tempera paint did. It was something that you could be able to go back and rework infinitely. You could make it into thin layers and apply it as a glaze. It was very good for blending 2 different colors together with. So oil was the major paint revolution that we see come around in the time of the Renaissance, around the 1500s. Now, watercolor and gouache, these are both water-based paint. So they have a binder that whenever you're mixing it up with water, you are just putting the pigment in the water and you can dilute it and make it transparent when you apply it to the surface. With gouache, specifically, that paint has white pigment added, so it is not transparent or translucent like watercolor is, but it has opacity to it. It's opaque. Now, acrylic was the next great revolution in paint that we have coming around as early as the 1930s, where this is the first paint that is synthetic. Rather than making a binder out of naturally occurring materials like linseed oil or water or egg, in the case of acrylic, you are using a polymer. So this is a plastic, essentially, and it dries and turns into that hardened plastic. So it's waterproof. You don't have to worry about spilling water on it like with watercolors, and it will. With mosaic and tapestry here at the end, These were two that were not actually paints, but they are used to create images, so we included those into the chapter here. But when we look at a Diego Rivera, you can see fresco, he's using plaster to be able to create this piece. Mixing those pigments in and then applying it to a surface. Whereas with John Sonsini here, you've got Fernando Manuel and David, and it's oil on canvas, and he's using impasto. He's not blending this paint together, he's just applying it very heavily to the surface. This Wilfredo Lamb here in gouache, remember that whenever we're using a gouache, you have white pigment that's been added, and it's not transparent, so we can't see down to the surface underneath. All of these colors are opaque. So familiarize yourself with the paint medium. Alright, moving into chapter 8 now on printmaking. We had several different processes for preparing a matrix so that we could make copies of an image. And with the top one over here, we've got relief. And when we're looking at relief, this is like a stamp. Remember, you can carve wood or you could carve linoleum. And any area that you remove, these lowered areas here, are what is going to not transfer. The ink, when you put it on with a roller, is going to stay only on these raised areas. So your design will have to be raised, inked, and then the matrix is pressed onto the paper to transfer that. The more tricky one to understand was intaglio, which is our other style or process of printmaking, where instead of having the ink stay on the raised areas, the ink in this case is down into lowered areas that have been scratched away with a burin tool that we can use in the form of engraving, or it could be etched away with acid, like ferric chloride, eating down into the metal sheet, and then ink is applied, wiped off of all of these raised areas, and then as the paper goes through the press and an extreme amount of pressure is applied, you have the paper being pressed down into these low-lying areas and transferring your design. How about lithography? Remember the root of the word here, litho, from Paleolithic or Neolithic. It means stone. So you're making a stone image here. In this case, you're depending on the principle of oil and water not mixing. You will have this greasy, oily ink that will be applied to the surface of the stone, creating the image of the apple here. And then once that is transferred onto the paper, after the stone plate has been wet with water, as the paper rolls over, it will only transfer this image. It won't smear out and then touch all the areas where you didn't want the ink to be. Screen printing, as we talked about the last one here, is the most familiar. You wear garments that have screen prints on them. Anytime you've had an image applied to fabric, usually this is how it was done. So you're dealing with a permeable membrane. It often was always used from silk, so you have it often called silk screen, but in this case it is a fiber and it has small holes in it. So if you put a resist on all this gray area and cause that to be resistant to the ink going through, when you apply your squeegee and push the ink through the lighter area here where you still have fabric that has not had a resist applied, that's the only area that the ink is going to go through. So it will transfer over to either your paper or maybe it's a t-shirt that you're doing that screen print on. So the next term you want to remember is registration. Remember the 90-degree marks that will be placed on a paper on the printing press so that when you're printing with multiple colors, we make sure that all of the plates line up with one another and you're not going to have a skewed image. You're going to make sure that when you line up the plate with the yellow, the plate with the red, the plate with this darker green, and then the plate with the black, that they are all going to be perfectly in the position that they need to be to make that image look right. When we're talking about printing with multiple colors, if you're trying to figure out how many matrix plates were prepared to make a colored print, then you just count the colors. Remember, if you have blue and green and some tan and some cream and then brown, I think there's even another color because we've got some like pink that's in this dress here. So probably 6 different colored matrix plates. And then they would have had to have registration to make sure that each one of those, when you line it up on the paper, is going to end up exactly where it needed to be. So moving into the 9th chapter on photography, we looked at some early photographic techniques. One of them was Joseph Niepce, who came up with the heliograph, which took around 8 hours at minimum to develop one photograph. And they were not on film, they were on metal plates. This was improved upon by Louis-Jacques Daguerre and the daguerreotype like we see in this image. And this is, if you'll remember, the first person that was ever photographed. They stood still long enough for his process of daguerreotype to make an impression on this copper plate using silver iodide. So the issue with the daguerreotype was that you could not make copies of this. We had to make a single development for each one of these metal plates that we could develop an image on the surface of. As the 20th century approaches and we have cameras like the Brownie camera made by George Eastman Kodak Company, we start to have many more cameras coming onto the market and available for people. We also have photojournalism. So evidence of these photojournalists going out and taking pictures and bringing them back revolutionizes what print media can be. Instead of just reading a story, you're able to see a picture and understand more fully what is going on at that place where the photograph was taken. Pictorialism was one of the styles of early photography that we saw, where we're posing models, much like painters used to do, setting up a scene, having to have them stand very still while those early photographs were developed. And then this style was really lending itself to the more narrative style of storytelling that we see painters using for centuries before this in their paintings. So pictorialism is this posed style. But remember, this is because the cameras in the 1800s, those early processes, they were not able to capture motion. So you had to set people up in still life. Versus the pure photography or straight photography, where we see artists, photographers taking pictures of life as it exists. As the processes get better at capturing very quick stills of life as it existed, we have this style of photography exist. And also thinking about landscape photography with this Ansel Adams here, just taking pictures candidly. We also had Man Ray and the Dada movement, using a method that was similar to William Henry Fox Talbot and the calotype, where objects are being placed over photosensitive paper and then exposed to light to create an image like we see here. All right, moving into chapter 11 on sculpture, everybody. Remember that there are examples of relief that we talked about in the sculpture chapter that differ from relief in printmaking. So we had 2 examples, low relief or bas relief, that we can see with the Mayan examples over here on the left, and they are low relief because of the depth. We're really just inscribing outlines and contour lines into the surface of the stone here, versus high relief where we have the images in the form of the figurative sculpture here. Almost half of the body is raising up off of that carving. And in the case of the Gates of Hell here by Auguste Rodin, we actually had sculptures that are leaving that background entirely, starting to come out at you. So they are considered high relief because of that depth of carving here. But while you might get pretty close to a successful print if you were using one of these low reliefs as a matrix, it still probably wouldn't come out perfectly. And it especially wouldn't work if you were trying to put ink on a high relief and then print it onto paper. So sculptural relief, low relief, and high relief is different from what we were talking about in chapter 8 on relief in printmaking, making a stamp that you can then press onto paper. So with sculpture, remember we had 4 major categories, and they were broken up into additive and subtractive, depending on if you were adding material or removing material, like in the case of carving. But modeling, the first one there, it's additive. You're taking clay and adding it to a form, starting to keep piling your oil-based clay like plastiline, or maybe it's just a water-based clay, more like Play-Doh, that you can add onto a form and build up onto an armature if you need some support underneath of it. But that is how you would start to make an object that you could make a mold out of if you were doing indirect casting, our next method. To make a rubber mold around that clay that you have modeled, and then be able to remove that mold in several pieces so that you could pour wax into it and make a casting that you could recast and make copies of. So direct casting, if you'll remember, is when you are taking wax, carving it into a shape, making a mold around it, burning it out, and then pouring the metal into that mold. And usually the mold is made of sand and clay. So once you break that metal that you've poured out of the mold, then you can no longer use that mold anymore. You have to use indirect casting and make a rubber mold if you want to be able to make more than one wax copy that can then be burned out and made into more than one metal sculpture that are identical. So refamiliarize yourself in the chapter on that if it's still unclear, the difference between indirect casting and direct casting. But the two that are a lot easier is carving. As you probably know, using a tool. It could be a chisel, it could be just a knife, but you are subtracting material. So starting with a piece of stone or a piece of wood, and then scraping away until you have revealed the object that you're trying to sculpt underneath. Whereas assemblage is additive. We really don't see this coming around until after the Industrial Revolution really gets going, where we have a lot of remnants from manufacturing processes that artists can get their hands on, like steel from construction, and then start to put those together into sculptures. We spent a lot of time discussing in chapter 11 on sculpture the human figure and figurative sculpture representing the human form. And we discussed one major innovation that we see as we're looking at the human figure over the course of history, for example, coming from the ancient Egyptians here, that we can identify by the style. When we're looking at the posture, how they're straight up, bolt upright, their feet are pointing in the same direction rather unnaturally. And this is not how we typically stand if we are just waiting somewhere or talking to a friend. In this case, what we start to see is that as sculpture gets more realistic, we're adding posturing to those figures. So especially in the case of the ancient Greeks and on into the figurative sculpture of ancient Rome, we see contrapposto, as in this counter pose. So if you'll remember from the chapter, we're talking about the angle that we see the parts of the body. So there's a slight slant to the shoulders and there's a slight slant to the hips that make this counter posture happen. And this is how we really do stand. We're putting weight on one leg and then counterbalancing the top half of our body to make that posture more comfortable instead of standing straight up and down like we see with the Egyptian sculpture. Also, familiarize yourself with some of those earthworks that we went over. We looked at some earthworks from Robert Smithson, Spiral Jetty that we have at the Great Salt Lake here in Utah, and this Serpent Mound, much more ancient earthwork that we have in Ohio, and then Andy Goldsworthy, who I gave you a brief film clip to look at also, which was making sculpture out of the environment where you are installing it. So all of these have been made out of materials gathered at the site. In the case of the Serpent Mound and Robert Smithson's Spiral Jetty here, they are much more permanent, whereas Andy Goldsworthy's, if you're making a piece out of ice or out of leaves, you've got to take a picture of that really quickly, or the wind might take it away, the sun in the case of the ice sculpture, but this is something to consider when documenting your work. Remember also our discussion of installation. So instead of thinking about a sculpture like something that you would go and see in a museum on a pedestal, the idea of an installation being a room that you would enter, that the entire room is that art object. We looked at Thomas Hirschhorn's work here. He's making this giant cake, and there's all these symbolism, iconography that has been added by the artist to give you more information about what he is discussing in the work. And it's almost just completely overwhelming in this piece, the amount of information in this installation here. So we move into chapter 12 on the craft medium, also referred to in the chapter as arts of ritual, and we're dealing with types of making that go much further back in history than the invention of the first art object. We're talking about functional medium, something that you could make useful objects out of that had a purpose in daily life. So think about what all of these had in common. With clay and glass, the history of making vessels with those objects, making something that you could put liquid into, or maybe gather berries or grains and then place them inside of this material in a vessel form that would give you the ability to preserve them. You can start to put things away and save them from getting wet and rotting. With metal and wood, we have a long history of functional objects there too, making tools, making furniture, making even our own dwellings like our early houses out of. And then we had some other materials that were included in this list also, ivory, jade, and lacquer, which were discussed in the chapter, as well as fiber arts. So anything that we are taking natural materials in our history, like plant fibers or animal fur, and then weaving that into, or spinning that into a fiber that we can use to either decorate, make vessels, or make clothing out of to keep ourselves warm or protect ourselves from the sun. All right, looking at clay, we definitely want to remember porcelain, like we can see here, an invention that we have coming from China. And porcelain was renowned for its beautiful white quality that we see here and its reflective glaze on the surface. When we talk about glaze in the chapter, we also want to remember the chemical science that goes into the making of glaze, or all of these colors that we see painted onto the surface. So we can't just use regular paint. This has to be something that when we put it into a fire of up to 2,700 degrees Fahrenheit, that those compounds are not just going to burn up and turn to ash like if we use normal pigment like we use for paint. This has to be something from a mineral source or something chemically derived that we can add to the ceramic, and then once it comes out of the fire, it will have that color presence burned into the surface. So remember glaze, and especially this style of porcelain with ceramic. With wood, remember furniture being one of the great inventions that comes with the ability to work wood. And in this case, we even have some metal that's been added to it. In the case of this gold leaf. So the reason that we have this chair of Atephares from Egypt that is going back 4,500 years plus at this point is because it was in an arid climate and in a sealed tomb. So with the tomb being sealed, insects can't get in, water can't get in, it hasn't been able to catch on fire, and it has been preserved. Normally, this is not the lifespan of an object made out of wood. If it's exposed to the elements, it's going to break down and rot. So another way to preserve our wooden objects is with lacquer. And we see metal being added here in the up to 30 coats that were applied to this surface to protect it from the elements. And when you're applying all of those layers of lacquer, you can also go back in and trap other materials within it. So it's transparent, we can see through it, and so we can see all of this gold leaf that's been applied and all this mother of pearl shell that has been trapped in that lacquer on the wooden box here. But this has also allowed this wood to remain very well preserved. With fiber arts, we also definitely want to remember the nature of narrative storytelling that we have with this art form. Not just the passing down of the skill, the ability to make these baskets and the process of weaving, but we also have in many cultures that use basket weaving as a way to tell stories, to pass down legends of creation or stories about where the people came from originally. And this is something that we see with this fiber art, as well as being able to include other materials. So you've got natural materials coming from plants, but then also these feathers and little bits of shell that have been integrated into that weaving. Also remember the arts and crafts movement. Go back and brush up on that, because we have a period in the early 1900s where we start to see a renaissance of the crafts. So after the Industrial Revolution, when everything starts to become made by machine, and the craftspeople who have been making these objects for thousands of years up to this point, being passed down generation to generation, no longer have jobs. One machine is going to take 100 people's job that were making those types of objects. But what people notice is that the types of things that get produced in a mechanical fashion in an assembly line do not have the same feeling as something that was made by hand. Something that a craftsman put a lot of time into is definitely something that's going to be much more long lasting. You can pass it down to the next generation yourself. So thinking about Gustav Stickley here and his woodwork in this table, this table isn't going anywhere. I made the comparison to a little metal card table that if you fell on it or something too heavy was placed on it, it would just collapse. Whereas this table is made by hand. It's very sturdy and well crafted. So this was not just woodworking that we see this. Metalsmiths, potters, fiber artists, all trying to revive these crafts that were appearing as if they might die out. So with moving into chapter 13, we just finished this. The lecture is up on Canvas now, but we split our architectural forms into two different basic systems. The shell system, using one material, and the skeleton and skin system, where we had two materials, one for structure and one for a sheath or a skin on the outside of them. And we also did a lot of discussion about the weight of material, especially if we're talking about the shell system, stacking and piling, and load-bearing construction, that the weight of the stone that you're using governed the types of forms that you could make. And then we begin to talk about tensile strength as well. Like if you were making a structure out of stone, it does not have very much tensile strength. You have to put many vertical supports in the form of post and lintel up underneath those so that the stone does not crack and then come tumbling down from above. So in the case of hypostyle halls, as we see here, we cannot just have one column on one end and one on the other and then a long horizontal stone lintel, because it would just break. We have to have all of these supports underneath, so it creates almost like a forest of columns, of posts, and then the horizontal lintels on top in the hypostyle hall. Definitely want to remember the Greek orders, the Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian columns coming from ancient Greece. If you remember with the first one, with the Doric column, you have no base down here at the bottom, and then it's a very, very basic capital here at the top, where you just have rounded and then a flat stone before it meets the architrave and the frieze and cornice, the structures above here. As we go on through history, once we get to the Ionic, they get a little bit fancier. They add a base, and they start to carve these capitals at the top. So instead of just having these rock slabs that are placed on the top of the Doric column, they're taking a lot of time to carve these capitals. But it still has this structure above it, the architrave, frieze, and cornice. The fanciest one, the most recent, was the Corinthian, and we see that it just gets more detail, more decorative carving in the capital there at the top, and then is capped off by your architrave, frieze, cornice, and then above that, not pictured here, would be the pediment, the triangular structure above it. Now, we enter a point in this chapter where we talk about what was going on in the ancient architecture. Concrete was one of them. When we looked at structures like the Pont du Gard, the bridge in France, where you've got all of those arches on the top of it, concrete was used to make a waterway, but they could not do anything like this with a cantilever here and this concrete structure that extends out into space but then has no columns underneath it. And that is achievable by adding tensile strength. So in this case, you're reinforcing that concrete with steel bars, rebar on the inside, and then that is making it strong enough so it can horizontally overhang like this and have no columns or posts underneath it supporting that. So remember Frank Lloyd Wright's Falling Water. Definitely see that one again. So make sure to go back to Canvas and check out any other materials that you need for studying here. You've got your final study guide with all of your terms in order as they appear in the chapter. And then if you're trying to find this document itself that we just looked at, remember it's this PowerPoint file here that's entitled Final Review. So let me know if you have any questions, and when you're looking for the test, remember it will not launch until the night of May the 14th at midnight. So at 12:01, which is technically May the 15th, that will be when you're available to take the exam, and it will close at midnight on May the 18th. So you've got 4 full days to get that in. Let me know if you have any other questions.